as Mike kind of let you know, I am the current Vice President of Legislative and Policy Affairs with the Virginia chapter of the American Planning Association. We have a long-standing relationship with CPAV, and we're glad to be here. Any of you who were here last year will remember George Homewood, our previous Vice President and current President of the chapter, doing a similar presentation. I'm also on the board of Plan Virginia as the Director for Region 9. Because I'm a planning commissioner in Matthews, and I'm a staff planner in Gloucester County, so I like planning. Yeah, what I'll be doing today is just running through some of the legislation that we put together that impacts planning and zoning in Virginia that was passed in the 2013 session. Before I get started, I just want to say this is really just a FYI. If you, I'm not an attorney, and that list of things that I just gave you, attorney is not one of them. And more importantly, I'm not your attorney for your locality. So I think it's really important, if you see something, make a note of it and go back and talk to your county attorney and your staff about it and about how potentially it could be impacting your locality. There will be some time at the end for questions, but how any of this legislation impacts you specifically, I won't be able to help you with. Now, I think we do have a few attorneys here that might be able to shed some light on something, but this is more just informative and to give you something to let you know what happened in the 2013 session. So the first thing I'm going to do is go over some of the resources that we have available to planners in the state, and then just touch on these other subjects and go right into the recap. It says the good, the bad, and the ugly. It really wasn't that ugly this year, what got passed, but we'll get into that and talk a little bit about 2014, and I'm going to try to talk pretty fast and get through to any questions and discussion, input that you guys have, things that you are interested in thinking about for 2014. So as part of the work that we do through APA and legislative program, we put together several items. One we call the toolkit, and the title is actually that first bullet there. It's much longer than the toolkit, which is why we call it the toolkit. It goes over pretty much all of the tools available to localities. So Mike alluded earlier that we're going to be hearing people talking about proffers, impact fees, and other tools like that that are enabled this afternoon. I will, when I share this presentation out, I will make that a link so that you can go to the most recent copy of that if you're interested in finding out more. Every year we set a legislative agenda working with our legislative committee. Items that are either carryover from the previous session or things that we want to make sure get addressed in the current session, or at least try to. And then we put together after the session the key bills report, and all of those are available on that link that's provided there. And so you'll have a copy of the key bills available to you electronically through this. We're doing a couple of small updates to it right now, but that list of bills, which is what I'll basically touch on today, includes more bills than I will talk about today. Some of them are local. Since we're a Dillon Rural state, a lot of the things that impact planning and zoning are specific to one locality because they went to Richmond and asked for permission to deal with tall grass, derelict buildings, junk cars, some combination thereof. And then we do tracking during the session through Eldon James and Associates. He also helps put together each of those documents that I talked about earlier. He is a legislative consultant for the chapter and really helps to make sure that we are providing high quality legislative information to all of our membership. In addition, we work very closely with VML and BACO on a lot of issues, and I encourage each of you to check out their legislative pages for items that might be impacting your locality. They've got great resources that you can sign up for to follow either during the session or in the off season to let you know what's going on there. And then if you're interested in getting a planning perspective on some of the national items, APA, the National American Planning Association, has a policy website, and they blog about issues, contains policy guides, things that staff and planning commissions use as resources when you're writing code amendments and considering code amendments. There is also a national legislative agenda, and they talk a little bit about advocacy and what you can do to sort of make a difference in the legislative world. So what we'll be covering is what the General Assembly worked on during their short session this year, 46 days in Richmond. But that's the legislative process. There's also the regulatory process, which is pretty much, ongoing. That's if you follow the town hall site. You If you subscribe, you will get emails, lots and lots of them, to let you know everything that's going on in the regulatory side. That's known as the Virginia Administrative Code. We'll be talking about some changes to the Code of Virginia. So this graphic, I stood in the back of the room and realized it's a little blurry, so I'm sorry about that. I borrowed this from VACO's report instead of making my own table. But basically, this summary kind of leads you to the totals numbers at the bottom. It says 2,575 bills were introduced and 1,527 bills were passed. A breakdown of those that passed, you can see that 681 of them were non-binding resolutions. That basically means, actually there's a little notation there. This graphic I borrowed from VPAP, the Public Access Project. They put this together to sort of do a breakdown of the session. And it basically says that that's for the accomplishments of people back home. So just a resolution of thanks, congratulations, things like that. Then 489 of those bills were passed unanimously. They didn't get votes. They came out of committee, went straight into the floor, third reading, passed. And then 369 had what they call some opposition. And they do a further breakdown of those 369 to let you know that that little bottom square at the bottom that says closely contested, that's 40 bills. 40 bills were closely contested during the 2013 session. During this session, I mentioned earlier, this was a short session, 46 days, so they have a 45-day meeting time that's concurrent, and then they come back for one day in April and do the 46th day. This year, obviously, if you followed the news, that was when they sort of made the final decisions on transportation. Next year will be a long session, and that'll be 60 days. And it really doesn't, it can, during the short session, there's a smaller amount of bills that a legislator is able to patron, but other than that, the sessions are very similar. They just cram more into the short session, and but they're very similar in nature if you're in Richmond during either one of the short sessions or long sessions. So we identified key bills that are in the document I alluded to earlier, and they're really some of the same things we see every year and stand up here and talk about, and a couple of new items. But the biggest item we had this year for sure was transportation. So while most of these have one slide that I'll sort of just pass through quickly, there's probably 4 or 5 in here on transportation, and a lot of that is still coming together on the impacts of especially the fees associated with transportation changes. How many of you recently did you look at a secondary 6-year plan or 6-year improvement plan? And some of you might have noticed that there was actually money planned. That's new, and that's because of House Bill 2313. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. The first bill, House Bill 1448, basically was a bill to make things a little bit better. It created a program if you had failing septic systems that you could create a loan program as a locality or using your PDC, and helped with some of the ownership issues. If it was abandoned, there was a lot of errors in the signs. This sort of tried to address that so that if you had a failing system, it didn't just have to say failing because it was a big bureaucratic mess. You could work through it and hopefully have some resolution. House Bill 2048 basically took these sections of DCR and moved them over to DEQ, and I believe that's effective July 1, or is it June? It's coming up, and best of my understanding, I'm not an expert on this, but it's going to be sort of just, as I said, just basically a transfer, same staff and everything, and they're very busy, particularly with stormwater right now, but that is a very interesting change that took place with House Bill 2048, those programs moving to DEQ, back to DEQ in some cases. Speaking of stormwater, 2190 was an interesting bill. It basically said that if you're going to have more stringent ordinances than those set by the state, you need to notify DCR, which is technically going to be notified DEQ, with a letter. And then there's a time frame where the landowner or applicant can request a review. So that's if you have more stringent ordinances put into place. I don't know how many localities that's going to impact, but it's now codified. House Bill 2290 was another transfer of responsibility. So the nutrient management certification program went from DCR to the Soil and Water Conservation Board, and that board also gets to oversee district programs and allocate funds for those now. Senate Bill 774, the key word in here is non-residential buildings. So localities can demolish or remove non-residential buildings or structures, file the lien, and pass along that cost. There are a few, if you read the bill, a few additional requirements if you're in a historic district, extra steps that you need to go through prior to demolition. There were several bills associated with FOIA. I grouped them all together on one slide, and we have a whole presentation on FOIA later, so I'm not really going to touch on these because I think Sharon's presentation will be far superior and also get into a lot of the items that relate specifically to planning commissions and boards of zoning appeals. House Bill 1633 is interesting. It says that you have to notify VDOT of the intent to plant materials in the right-of-way. I think a lot of us are doing that already, but if you are not, then you have to bear the cost of making that project compliant and basically get the permits that you're required to have to be doing any work in VDOT's right-of-way. But obviously this bill was aimed at one bad seed. A lot of them are. House Bill 1419, a lot of you will remember Medi Cottages from the 2010 session. We talked a lot about it, particularly because we were very concerned about it usurping local authority as it comes to structures and even bulk regulations, although we were able to apply those. This was a modification that allowed for married couples to live in the POD. It changed some of the, one has to be impaired and one has to require assistance with one ADL, activity of daily living. And it extended the removal time from 30 days after the occupant left to 60 days. I can tell you from a planning perspective, we followed this bill closely. We worked on it. It actually planned to extend the removal time to 90 days. We asked for 60 and worked with the bill's patron. As hard as we fought Medi Cottages in 2010 because we really felt like it was getting into local land use issues, we kind of, during this session, one, had some large fish to fry. But at the same time, we didn't feel like this opened up Pandora's box. You know, this isn't going to impact that many. And how many of you know of a granny pod or a Medi Cottage in your locality? Okay. Yeah, not a huge amount of hands ever go up when I ask that question. So I don't think there's a huge proliferation right now, and I don't think this is going to greatly expand it. But that's just an update on those three changes that went into effect with House Bill 1419. Cemeteries, 1547 was also somewhat of a carryover from 2012. There were several committee meetings during the off season, and the cemetery industry basically feels they are a very specialized land use classification, and they should be treated differently than other land uses. And I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying they feel very strongly about it and have gotten the attention of folks who are willing to patron bills. This particular bill was not earth-shattering by any means. It basically addresses the tree canopy requirements for cemeteries, and it says tree canopy for cemeteries, not a minimum of 10%. So it's not huge, and it's probably consistent with how they would be treated under the current code. I think the bigger issue is that it is now the only use that is added into that section of state code. So if you go and read the section on cemetery, on tree canopies, which I'm sure all of you are doing all the time, it says residential, commercial. So it goes into your zoning classifications, and it talks about how to apply tree canopy to those zoning classifications. Now it says cemeteries, minimum 10%. That's the first use we've seen added in there. And I hope that, I put there may set a bad precedent. I hope that it doesn't, but we certainly don't want to see every single use get added into the state code. We like to think that we do zoning on the local level instead of Richmond, but I worry about this opening a little bit more of a door than what we've seen. So we're going to keep our eye on that. I do think we are going to hear more from cemeteries. It is my understanding they'd really like to see a model ordinance for the state. So we'll be watching cemeteries and keep you guys informed about House Bill 1853 says the planning commissions shall consult with installation commanders on any proposal that could impact the military installation. So it's a little vague, but I will have to tell you that earlier versions of this bill were a little too specific. So vague is probably not bad, and this is definitely one that I think you should talk to your staff and local county attorney or city attorney about, to make sure that you guys are following this and establish some sort of process. It can be basically sending a notification electronically, paper, some combination thereof. But the initial version of this bill basically required planning commissions to add someone from military installations to the planning commission, and then make them a non-voting member. And there were other things in there that sort of got fleshed out. So I would have to say that notifying them of what's going on is probably, a better version of this bill. And I think that most of us are notifying the public in general, and if the military installation is interested, they're following whatever website or newspapers you're using for notifications. But certainly, based on the land use conflict issues we've seen over the years, we want to be good neighbors to each other. So hopefully, that this was a step in that direction. Hopefully that it works out and we don't come back with any of those bad items in the future sessions. There's a couple bills dealing with cash proffers this year. 2239 basically is another one of those reminding you, one locality that stepped over the line a little bit, that cash proffers can only be used for capital improvements, and if it's an existing facility, it must expand capacity and cannot relate to the maintenance of that. From what I understand, a locality did a technology upgrade of some sort or something using cash proffer money, and it was determined that was not what that cash proffer funds were supposed to go towards, that it needs to expand capacity. It needs to be directly related to there being more density, more users for whatever the public facility is, because of the rezoning application. So this is just a strong reminder that you have to use that for expansion and not for maintenance. And that's all public facilities, and I encourage you to go in and read that section of the code where it is, to make sure that that's something that you're following along with in cash proffer world. Also, Senate Bill 1226 extended the time that you have to start using those cash proffers from 7 years to 12 years. I basically relate this bill to, we've done 2 extensions of our plats and plans. As you know, the recession will be over in 2017 because that was the last extension that we gave on those. And so now there's an extension. Oh, okay, well, localities might need a little more time. They might be feeling a few impacts of the economy to start utilizing those proffers. So that went from 7 to 12 years. 2238 is a very interesting bill that I also encourage you to go back and read the sections in code. And honestly, at the end, it doesn't really change things for most localities, although I think that the patrons of the bill, who may or may not be with us, had some thoughts. Initially, the way that it read was that once you got a plat or plan approval, you could go straight into getting your building permit. And a lot of times that is the case, but sometimes there are these documents and agreements that you have to have, It might be a stormwater maintenance agreement, it might be a surety associated with your landscaping, but you need to make sure that all those are in place. You don't just automatically get building permits and COs, and there is a correlation there. So I think this was, again, an instance of a locality that was trying to add some extra things in there, some things that maybe weren't as closely correlated to development. So at the end of the day, I don't think this changes a lot of things for localities, but it's worth taking a look at and making sure that you're following. House Bill 2298 was another one of those really bad bills that became a sort of okay bill. Basically, if you have a non-conforming existing billboard in your locality, and for some reason a road project or eminent domain impacts that, and that billboard has to be relocated or has to be removed, this bill says that it can be relocated on the same property and at the owner's expense. Those words, same property and owner's expense, were not in the earlier versions of the bill, and I believe it said at the cost of the locality in the one of the first versions. It's very interesting here, same property, does that mean same parcel? And so if someone who's impacted couldn't put it on the same parcel, do they still have the same? This is one of those that obviously it's a new bill and we don't know how it's going to play out, but I encourage you, if billboards are an issue, if they're existing non-conforming, this section of the code says it's going to remain non-conforming. It's going to keep those vested rights even though you're picking it up and moving it to any place. So it's very interesting, and just one of those land use items that was interesting from the 2013 session. 2326, it has the word plan in it, so I thought it was a good fit. I don't think it's really going to impact that many of us because if you read in the first line there, PDCs that conduct regional planning for multi-state councils, it basically says they can prepare regional strategic plans. So we're really thankful that Richmond is now letting them do that. Transportation. I am not a transportation expert. I tried to put these slides together like I was trying to explain this to myself, and I don't know if you have a lot of questions on transportation. I want to hear them. I don't know that I will be able to answer them, but it's something that through the chapter we're really working on, and I do plan by our July conference, which will be in Lansdowne, APA Virginia annual conference. Just a little plug there. We will have a panel, and part of the panel will be a real analysis of this bill. And so we'll be trying to get those resources to our membership. So transportation, House Bill 2313 is a really interesting bill, and it definitely is the one that's been in the news the most. Changes the way that revenue is collected and distributed for transportation, and then it also has this little tag in here that I thought we should just go ahead and talk about right up front. It prohibits tolls on I-95 south of Fredericksburg. That got added in based on obviously a lot of controversy that was associated with that, and we'll talk about some other bills that came about because of that. The first thing it does is eliminates the per gallon gas tax. I think we all know that. We all heard about how outdated it was and it wasn't tracking with inflation. So that's gone. It replaces it with a percentage-based tax, which will be on wholesale. 3.5 on gas, 6% on diesel, and I put the asterisk there to let you know. There's something like 0.02% of diesel cars in the state of Virginia. It's not a huge percentage, but the way that the code reads, I think there is a pounds associated. If it's less than 10,000 pound vehicle, there's going to be a way that they account for that. I don't know what that is, but there's a way that will be accounted for. That 6% on diesel is aimed at heavy traffic. Not on the passenger vehicles that run on diesel. So there's going to be a way that they address that. The asterisk is there just to remind me to tell you that, and we'll find out more. I'd heard that there would be a tax rebate end of the year sort of thing. I don't know how all that's going to flesh out. There's a registration fee for hybrids, alternative fuel vehicles, including electric, of $64. It was $100 in the original proposal. $64 is what was agreed upon. I'm not going to elaborate on the nexus between why, if you're getting rid of the gas tax, you would then need the fee, but we'll get into that at some other time. We want to discourage people from fuel-efficient vehicles, is what that says. Then there's an increase in statewide sales tax from 4 to 4.3. And that's going to be used for maintenance, rail, and transit, that extra 0.3. That component is statewide, and we'll keep following along because there's, depending on what part of the state you're from, there's also additional tax increases. Internet sales tax is based on a federal bill, the Marketplace Fairness Act. That bill, it hadn't even been introduced when our bill passed. It has since been introduced. It's sort of lingering out there. We have no control over how the federal officials will vote on this. So there is a section, and if you follow along in the bill, that says if it hasn't been passed by 2015, I think it just triggers another tax increase in general on sales tax. So we'll be keeping an eye on that because that will impact transportation here in the state. There is a phase increase in the tiling tax. There's an increase in the percentage of general sales tax that can be used for transportation. So that doesn't correlate to an increase in taxes. It just says instead of 0.5%, you can use 0.675% funneled towards transportation. I have a feeling that right off the bat, that's some of the changes that we saw in our 6-year improvement plans that we've just recently been looking at. That money we're not having to wait for. Additional sales tax of 0.7 and 2.1 on motor fuels wholesale in Hampton Roads, and actually Hampton Roads, not just one road, Hampton Road, and Northern Virginia. And that is in addition to that 0.3% increase. So very interesting. If you're from Northern Virginia, there's all of these additional items that apply to you, and that includes the 3% state transient occupancy tax. There's an additional recordation fee. It basically breaks down of those, though, that 30% of these increases are going to be going to localities, and the remainder it has to be used on regional projects. And that is the same in Hampton Roads, those percentages, 30% and 70%. It dedicates $1 million in the upcoming fiscal years to phase 2 of the metro extension, and then it indicates that in 2020 there will be $20 million associated with the Route 58 corridor development fund. So a lot of those specific items got added into the bill there. So that's kind of a breakdown. Hampton Roads and Northern Virginia are going to see additional tax increases, and then statewide we're going to see that 0.3. And then the fuel changes, eliminating the gas tax and going to the wholesale, which will happen. That percentage-based tax will be, it'll hit you before you get to the tank. So that's kind of the Cliffs Notes version of the bill. It's a long bill. There's a lot of information in it. And again, we plan to put together a full analysis that we'll be providing at our chapter conference in July, and we can make that available to our Plan Virginia membership as well, because a lot of this goes into effect July 1. There's a few other bills associated with transportation. Senate Bill 1075 basically says that if you terminate a project, you may be responsible to pay back VDOT. I have a feeling of what this was aimed at. I'm not 100%. Basically, if you enter into an agreement with VDOT on doing a project and you pull out for whatever reason, and a lot of times that's just political pressure or things come up, you may be responsible to pay VDOT back for the costs incurred in that. That's something to really keep in mind. I think that by the time you've entered formally into something with VDOT, most localities are going to stay with it, but some of that initial PE work and things like that, I think that scares folks, but I don't think by that point you've entered that formal agreement. But just be aware of it in case you have a VDOT project going on that you're thinking of pulling out on. You may owe the state some money. Then there was Senate Resolution 30, and I mentioned earlier when we were talking about tolls, this basically creates or asks the Senate Committee on Finance to study ways to mitigate the impacts of tolls on Virginia's disadvantaged citizens. If you followed any of the toll discussion that went on during the session, there was a good discussion about how you would be really hurting some of the people who are worse off more, and in various different ways. And a lot of good ideas and thoughts came forward on the impacts of tolls, and those who are more rural tend to be the drivers who are going to pay those. And then there was a lot of really good discussion. I hope to see that the committee comes back with good information for them to use, because we know that tolls probably haven't gone away in the discussion of how to pay for things. Could be that House Bill 2313 solves all of our transportation problems forever and we never have to consider tolls. That could happen. But in the meantime, they are studying this, and I anticipate that, though I didn't check, I anticipate that that'll be ready for the 2014 session. There were several key bills that weren't passed. I mentioned earlier we focused energy and attention on some bills, particularly House Bill 1430, that had a larger impact on land use. If you followed House Bill 1430, I classified it there as right to farm. If you were able to see it in the media anywhere, including Fox News, it was known as the Bonita Bill. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it. If you didn't hear about it, I encourage you to take a look, because we have been told that this is definitely coming back for the 2014 session. And it's a good premise, but it was, I think, put together in a way that just wasn't palatable to most folks. The premise is that the locality would not let a woman host birthday parties for 8-year-olds on her property. That was the very generic, the locality is very cruel to me and wouldn't let me do this. And I have a farm and I need other ways to generate money. And I think that in Virginia our culture is very closely tied to agriculture. I think that we don't tend to be negative towards all aspects of agriculture, and agritourism is a huge industry in the state, and I think probably all of us are seeing, small cottage industries and things popping up related to it. In this particular case, it was one of those, it got sort of reported on one way, but the facts were over here and not being vetted out as well in the media as they probably should have been. This basically stepped in, and in the initial version of the bill, said that if you have an agriculturally zoned property or an agriculturally used property, that you could pretty much do any sort of retail. In some areas, or some of us who discussed this bill, it was sometimes called the Right to Walmart bill. And it actually had nothing to do with Walmart, but it said that you could have art, literature, it had a huge list of things that you were able to do because you had a farm. And I love farming. I grew up on a farm. I didn't see the nexus there, and a lot of people didn't, and it really, from a land use perspective, it was not as closely looked at as it could have been. The good news is actually, the bill, it made its way around it and had a few different versions, but ultimately, I believe it was pulled by the patron, and who said that it would be coming back. The good news is that a lot of stakeholders starting this week are meeting and talking about this bill and what it wanted to accomplish and how we could maybe do it better in the 2014 session. So I have very high hopes for that, and we'll definitely keep you posted, because it was very closely tied to land use, and I think that it would have impacted probably everyone in the room. So it was a very interesting bill, and if you just have tons of free time and want to go to LIS and read it, especially the earlier version, for those of you who are staff to any locality, it said that you could be held personally responsible for enforcing your ordinance, personally liable. It didn't even say zoning administrator. It was like all staff, and I took that personally. It's one thing if they attack the zoning administrator, but it's another thing if it's like all staff. For enforcing the ordinance that your board passed, it was entertaining, but maybe not in the most positive way. And there's a couple of...
There may have been some political overtones in the bill by way of paper. Maybe that'll not be present when it comes back.
Could be. Or have a different patron, depending on how the elections go. So House Bill 2223, so there was a few bills that we sort of would classify as anti-Agenda 21, and any of you who were here last year or have this in your localities, I'm not going to speak to it, but it was specifically brought out in these bills. One's a bill, one's a joint resolution. And there were others, but I thought that these were interesting. Illegal for the state and political subdivisions to adopt any items that may be referenced in UN Agenda 21 documents. I haven't read this document, but from what I understand, it's many pages, and it may be referenced in there. I didn't think that was best wording of the bill. And then the Joint Resolution 654 actually made it out of the House and went over to the Senate, and it opposes UN Agenda 21 and its radical plan of purported sustainable development. That's a quote from that joint resolution there. And again, it was a joint resolution, so it passed the House, went over to the Senate, and didn't pass the Senate. But had it just been a House resolution, then that would be on the books right now. As a joint resolution, it went away. But purported radical plan of purported sustainable development. So be on the lookout for that, it happening in the locality near you. For 2014, it is a little bit early. One of the things that we'll be looking at are the November elections. With all of these new positions coming in, you're going to see a potential for change in control of the Senate. Right now, with the even division, you had the Republican lieutenant governor who, when possible, he couldn't vote on everything and break every tie, but pushed it towards the right. With the Democratic lieutenant governor, which could happen after the November elections, you might see it go the other way. So that's just one of the potential changes that could come from the elections. So we'll be keeping an eye on that and how that will impact the 2014 session. And obviously the economy, I mentioned the extensions we've been doing and thinking about how, that the economy and the downturn and now hopefully what we're in is an upturn have been impacting things. And it's yet to be determined what will be the long-term effects of sequestration in some of these areas of the state that are very highly tied to the federal spending. And I mentioned earlier right to farm. I also mentioned earlier cemetery. So there's a few things that we have a pretty good feeling that we might see or that we know are being worked on in the off-season, getting ready for 2014. My conclusion, I would just say this odd picture of a soccer ball with hands on it is to let you guys know that what I do for APA as Vice President of Legislative and Policy Affairs is a complete team effort. We have a legislative committee that tracks legislation together, provides insight, has great questions and great feedback that we can use with our legislative consultants, provides expert testimony on behalf of planning in the state. And I mentioned earlier, Eldon James and Associates is our legislative consultant, and they do fantastic work on behalf of the chapter. So it's really a team effort, and the work that we do together enables us to produce the documents and the tools that we provide for planners across the state. Again, I wanted to say that I love talking about any of these bills, but basically, some of them are going to be covered later by some attorneys and other speakers. And always check with your local attorney on how any legislation might impact you, because there's obviously different interpretations depending on which attorney and which locality that you're in. But it's a good place here to talk to your neighbors and friends about how they're dealing with either legislation that just passed or passed in the last session. Find out from those folks that have Medi cottages how that's going and how they track them. Interesting things like that. So that's all I have for you guys.